Welcome to Getting Personal with Plant Medicine. I'm your host, Diana Crash, and today I am joined by Mallory O'Connor. How are you doing today, Mallory?
I'm doing awesome. How are you?
Good. So, you have been talking about the war on drugs and fighting against stigma from a very young age. And it was even before you were a consumer of plant medicine. So, I couldn't think of a better person to come on and talk about prohibition with children. And we're not just talking about alcohol prohibition today, right? Even though that is part of it, I'm sure. But anyway, let's begin with what children are currently learning about drug policy in school. You have children of different ages in your household. So can you talk a little bit about how you disabuse kids of the propaganda they're learning in school?
Um, you know, my kids are not really learning a lot of propaganda in school, which they're not really learning anything. I have a 14-year-old and a 5-year-old and a 6-year-old, and I'm constantly asking what they're learning in school. And both of them, all of them pretty much tell me that, aside from, a little bit in health class with my daughter who's in high school, they're really not learning that much. I know around here, I live in Connecticut, DARE has kind of gone away for the most part, which I think is great, because I was just talking last night about the tons of misinformation that we learned in DARE, that, we are now learning wasn't true. And that even a lot of the research before DARE showed that what was going to be taught in DARE wasn't true. We still had an entire curriculum for children that was just complete propaganda and being false. So I think with anything where a school is misleading my children, at least for my judgment, is I try to, from day one, be open and honest with them. I have never really hid my cannabis use from my children. I think that if you told my children that cannabis was wrong, they'd probably look at you like you had three heads, because it is so normalized for them. So I think that's really the biggest part of really any parenting, is making sure that our kids are learning these, basic things from us, just like, your kid should not be waiting until third or fourth grade to be learning that there's poison underneath the cabinet. Your children should also be learning about, what you have in the house, and what I have in the house is cannabis. So just not hiding things from them.
I think that is the biggest part of all, because I think that sometimes, even unintentionally, parents hide things because they think they're filtering their child's experience in a way, like we're protecting them, But the reality is that we're doing the opposite of that. We're not preparing them for things that can come up. And prohibition is a layered and complicated topic. And like you said, there really isn't a lot of education out there for children. I have found some like DARE adjacent programs that are still in certain schools, but they don't really talk about prohibition and what that means. And I mean, I just think back to school, and I think, like I mentioned earlier, the alcohol, that's all I can remember learning about when in that kind of a framework, like what is prohibition. I don't think there's any real books that I've found. I've looked everywhere and I can't find any like basic, simple books that break this down into a way that's accessible to children. So like, what is your suggestion where do you start? I mean, I know you just said being honest is a big part of it, but like, how do you approach these conversations at different age points in their lives?
So I kind of will ask what they know about it first, because then because it can be a very open topic talking to your kids about this. Where do you start? So really just asking what they know about it. And then kind of taking it from there, getting there. Well, do you think it's bad? Kind of, where did you hear that it was bad? Because then, if they heard it was bad and they heard it from the DARE officer, kind of what that content is versus like, did you tell it to your teacher? Then you kind of know that you might be getting a phone call in a while. But, really gearing it towards what they know and taking it from there. Telling my kids how I use it. They pretty much know, but if they ask questions, I'm always very open. I also using other people to talk to in front of them, because kids are, they're naturally eavesdroppers, and what you're telling your friends, they're going to hear too. So, I'll talk about cannabis with my friends around them, showing my kids, this is a bag of cannabis. This is what I use it for. Really empowering with all of that. It kind of changes the subject of it, instead of it being this like big scary drug that they heard about it in school. It really is just like a plant, like tea that you're gonna have in your cabinet too.
So switching perspectives a little bit, since you wrote about it as a child, how were you able to take such a big concept and break it down as a child?
I really watched the epidemic of opiates destroy lives. Starting from a very young age, I had a family member who ended up getting AIDS from using heroin. And from there, I saw my friends get addicted to drugs. I saw my family members get addicted to drugs. And, I also live in Connecticut, where, is Purdue Pharma, like, kind of started the whole epidemic. So I watched all of this going down, and then I remember California legalizing for medical, and I remember watching, and I was very like politically forward when I was a kid. Like, I loved like anything about the 60s. I read all the Abby Hoffman books. Like, I was always protesting about, anything. So when I saw that, and obviously in any of that content, you have like, cannabis is fine, cannabis is cool. So I also like that really normalized it for me. And I saw that, Congress like pretty much wouldn't even look at using cannabis for medical use. And I was just like, so you guys will like promote this drug that since I was like single digits in age, I've watched people get addicted to, and then do heroin, then overdose. That's fine with you, and you make that legal, but you won't even test to see if a plant that like legit grows from the ground works. Like, and it does. And again, it's this craziness of like, we knew it worked, and we just made up all this stuff about it. And, so also using, I really love, I actually saw a musical the other day that was done fantastic, but Reefer Madness. I think that like when you watch that video, it's like
the original one or the
yes.
recent? Oh,
So
yeah.
Yeah.
That is, whoa.
I saw a musical the other day here, and it was honestly the best musical I've ever seen. These kids did a great job, but it was like a comedy based on Reefer Madness. It was so well done.
At a high school, or was that just like old?
So it was a local theater company, and they did it like at this little bar locally. There was only like 8 people, and they did like the best job. They were so talented. It was just hilarious.
I love that.
It was cool. One of the local dispensaries actually sponsored a couple shows too, so that was fun.
That is amazing.
But I think that Yeah. But I think that, exposing them to that kind of like silly propaganda too really helps them understand, like, okay, this is just not true. And, I think it's a lot easier to these days too to get kids to understand, like, maybe some stuff your government told you was not true than in the past. So we have that.
Yeah. Well, one thing you touched on a bit, and that I want to get your opinion on is harm reduction. I mean, just even what you're talking about, how you grew up in that environment, and I did as well. And even having family members who were counselors and who understood, at the time what the approaches were for treating, substance use disorder and things like that. The discussion about harm reduction, there was no discussion, right? There was no discussion.
Yeah.
And to just think back on all of the times and opportunities where we could have implemented some type of harm reduction and saved lives of family members and friends. And while I understand that's a very big conversation and maybe it's not suited for younger children, how would you suggest having that conversation with teenagers? Because I know, especially now, there's a lot more available for teenagers, and while they do have a lot of education at the tip of their fingers on their cell phones, they may not be guided in the right direction. So you can go down a very dangerous rabbit hole one way or the other if you're not guided correctly online, right? So what would your advice be for that kind of conversation?
I think with anybody, when somebody asks me, like, well, what about for harm reduction, is which is really better and which is going to save this person's life. Today, I mean, the conversation may have been different, 8 to 10 years ago when people were able to buy heroin off the street that wasn't going to just instantly kill them 8 out of 10 times, or even drugs that they wouldn't expect to have an opiate 3 out of 10 times, I'm very open with my kids, so they, my 5 and 6-year-old know they don't use Narcan. My 14-year-old, she knows how to use Narcan. So I always explain to them as one is better than the other, and if using cannabis is going to prevent somebody from going out and maybe using heroin that has, fentanyl in it, which they're probably going to end up with, and they're probably going to overdose on, then yeah, the alternative is fentanyl. And are there other alternatives? Yes, there's Suboxone, which you're also going to get addicted to, and you're probably going to lose your teeth. There's methadone, where you're going to have to go down to a clinic every single day and do that medicine. And also, you're going to have people outside that clinic 9 out of 10 times offering you those drugs that can kill you, And unfortunately, that is a reality of, what today is and what our kids have to deal with. And, I think that when you're real with your kids and you're like, well, it's a choice between, running this fentanyl strip on what you're doing or smoking a little bit of weed, then yeah, you should. The weed is the better alternative. And, I'll stand by that. And I think there's plenty of other herbs too that we, have known about and people are more open to in harm reduction. And I don't see, and again, like, I have a chip on my shoulder about pharmaceuticals. I was on them at a very young age, way too young. And they really messed with me being younger. And I think that there are herbs that would have worked better with my body. So I definitely come at it from my standpoint, but I also come at it as whatever works for you. If somebody tells you that flying, airplanes makes them better and not want to get high, who cares what helps, whatever is helping you, so long as it's not hurting you, so long as it's not hurting other people, that's what you should be doing. And that's kind of, what I tell my kids. And to anybody else who doesn't want to get that deep into it, it's just another kind of medicine, and that's really as simple as you have to be with your kids.
Mm-hmm.
That's how simple you have to be with most adults.
Yeah. True words. So going back to the Reefer Madness again, did you talk about that with your kids at all? Did they see that with you? How do you talk about?
So the younger ones have not.
Yeah,
the younger ones have not. My older one has. She obviously just thinks that it's silly because it is. I think that now kids it's not as big of a thing, but probably in other areas of the country it is just as big of a thing. I'm from the Northeast, and it's nobody cares here anymore. But so if we're and even more importantly, that's why we need to be talking to our kids about it, because if you do live in the area and other people are not open with it, that's when you run into trouble.
Yeah. Yes, and you can definitely run into trouble. And so just before we end this, what is your advice for how to talk to children about all of this? And I know that there are a lot of different parts of it, but specifically about the war on drugs and how it affects generations going forward.
Yeah. Number one, relating it to someone in your life who you probably at this point know who's gotten in trouble for cannabis. Talking about how it works. It really can open up a can of worms into anything. So again, always the first thing is just finding out what your kids know so that you don't end up down those rabbit holes that can get a little confusing and overwhelming for everybody. And then obviously if you're having this conversation with your kids, you're the kind of parent who is, open to your kid asking questions. So, a lot of these things, hopefully your kids can lead the way for you. And, if they don't the first time, just keep it simple and non-threatening for them. And they'll come back and they'll ask you for more.
I love that. And when you say non-threatening, do you mean like basically saying or not saying, don't touch that, don't use that, and explaining things more so than just telling them no?
Yeah, I mean, my kids know that if they use cannabis, they're probably going to get sick. My older daughter, I think she knows if she uses cannabis, she's not going to get sick. But I just don't think the appeal is there for her anymore because of how much I've used cannabis around her and my friends use cannabis around her. And if that's what she ends up doing over drinking, then hey, I'd rather sit around being stoned than sit around getting drunk.
Do her friends ever, want to come over because of her mom being so cool? I've been hearing that a lot lately.
It's funny. I do have a lot of them that follow me on Instagram. We've actually both me and my boyfriend have made it 18 plus since then. So, I think that I think that they're more intimidated because of who I am, because they kind of know that they're not going to get away with it. Like, I tell them all the time, I'm like, I will come pick you up. Like, you're not going to be in trouble. I'm like, but there will be consequences.
Like your friends follow me on Instagram. Okay, so.
Right, exactly.
Just remember that. Well, thank you so much for sharing your expertise once again. Tell people how they can support you and where they can find you.
So yeah, you can find me Normal Moms Club on pretty much every platform. That's the easiest way.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
Thank you. We'll see you soon.
This episode was produced by Your Highness Media, audio editing done by James Crash, and sponsored by mitragaya.com. Be sure to subscribe and rate our podcast if you haven't yet. And subscribe to our Your Highness Media newsletter on Substack for everything new going on in the Your Highness Media world.